Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on this beautiful hot sunny day. My name's Amy and I'm the Communications Manager here at Morepay. Today's topic is COVID-19 vaccinations and what employers need to know. So a few things to cover before we get going. First of all, you'll have noticed that your microphone's on mute. We do want to hear from you, especially for the live Q&A at the end of the webinar. So just drop your questions into the question panel shown here. We've got about 800 and something people registered for this, so I imagine we'll have a good few questions on the webinar. So our expert, Michelle, will do her best to get through as many as she can at the end of the session. Another note, if you're facing technical difficulties, don't worry too much. We will be sending everybody the recording. Just a note there that we are having some problems with our email system at the minute, so I'll do my best to get the recording to you by close of play today. But if not, it will definitely be this week, I promise. And then one final thing, if you are facing technical difficulties, do just flag it in the question panel, because if loads of them come flooding through, then I'll know it's an issue at our end, and I'll do my best to fix it. And I think that's everything that I needed to cover there. So what are we covering today on the agenda? So first up, who is required to have the vaccine? How do you store the vaccine information? How do you manage people who refuse the vaccine? How do you handle sick leave post people having the vaccine? And finally, how do you develop a vaccine policy? So lots and lots to cover today. And then obviously we'll wrap up with that live Q&A at the end of the session. Before I pass over to our presenter, I'm just conscious that we will have quite a few people on the webinar who maybe don't know too much about Morepay, so I will do a very brief introduction for you. So Morepay provide payroll software and HR software, as well as managed payroll and HR services, and we do this for more than 10,000 customers all across the UK, and we've been around for more than 50 years now. Our promise is to make payroll and HR easy, and we do that by focusing on 4 key things that you can see here. So first up is simple onboarding, because we know that switching to a new provider can be quite stressful. The second is easy to use software. The third is rich functionality, which basically means we pack our software with lots of great features and automation. And then finally is flexible services, and these are delivered by our in-house team of payroll and HR experts. So that's us. If you've got any questions about our offering, please drop those into the question panel and I will come back to you today. All right, so meet your presenter. So this is Michelle Hobson. If you've attended some of our webinars in the past, you will know Michelle well, a very seasoned webinar host. She joined Morepay in 2017. She's got more than 15 years of experience in HR. Of course, she's CIPD qualified, and she is our HR Services Director at Morepay. Good morning, Michelle. How are you?
Good morning, Amy. Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone on the webinar. So, vaccines. Before I get started on the deck that we've got in front of you, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some background and context to this. Obviously, vaccine is a huge hot topic at the moment, not just in workplaces, but in our personal lives as well. Who's had the vaccine? Which ones you have? It's become a topic of conversation that people have around the dinner table now, or back in pubs now are allowed to do that. But with it can come some controversy as well, because particularly where you're in places where it's not required that you'd have it, people have different opinions on whether you should or you shouldn't, and there's lots of different reasons for that. What we're trying to do in this webinar is look at it in the context of what we know the government have told us at the moment in terms of where they are saying you're going to have to be required to have had a vaccine. It isn't all set out yet. We have the basics of the information, but I'm sure you'll see at Morepay that we like to take the basis of that information, even if it is not fully set out, play that back to our customers, play that back to any prospects who are interested in the topic, and try and help you start thinking about it. So with all the topics that we're talking about with COVID, things are changing rapidly, and things may be different by tonight. But we like to make sure that we tell you what we know now and get you thinking about the right sort of things. I mean, for example, last night there's the indication that there may be needed to be vaccine passports to get into mass gatherings, large events, nightclubs going forward. This is a U-turn on what had been said before. No details have been given, no definite dates. It's just more of an insinuation at the moment. That further down the line may have implications for employers in those areas as well. And if it does, then we will come on to that. But if we just go on to the next slide then, who is required to have the vaccine at the moment based on what we know? And the biggest focus here is around care homes and care home workers. So in June 2021, they confirmed that they government have a proposal to make the COVID vaccine compulsory for all care home staff. There is reports that they will extend this to all NHS workers, but as of yet, that's not been confirmed. The initial information we've been given is that affected staff will be given 16 weeks to have the vaccine once it becomes law, or they will face redeployment within that organisation to something that isn't kind of face-to-face with residents, or they potentially risk losing their job. What we expect at the moment is that this will be made law in October 2021. The issue, therefore, would not come into force until 16 weeks after that date, whatever that date is in October. But after those 16 weeks have passed, at that point, affected employees must have either had both the dose of the vaccine, unless they are medically exempt, or businesses are going to have to deal with the consequences and the fallout for this. The other thing that we're expecting is that this is also going to apply to those entering the care homes to do work. So things like tradespeople, beauticians, people who go in to do outsourced health and safety, like we do in Morepay, whether that's people who come in to entertain the care home residents, they will also be required to follow it. So this is going to be quite far-reaching, but this is what we know at the moment. So on to the next slide then, we're just trying to think about what we can do at the moment to help these type of employees or businesses who know that they go into care homes, what they need to think about doing for their employees at the moment. You'll need to think about having a good recording system for who has and has not had the vaccine. That's going to be really important that this data is taken and it is securely stored. You'll need to hold meetings with employees who have not had the vaccine to find out why. Obviously, if they're medically exempt, and we're expecting some more information on what exactly medically exempt is, I'll talk about that shortly, then you need to be talking to employees as early as possible about the potential consequences that will happen if they don't take the vaccine. If they still refuse to take the vaccine, you would follow what we would consider a kind of a normal ER process, where you'd help look for alternative non-frontline jobs, which wouldn't require them to have had it. But if there are no alternative jobs, then you will need to terminate employment. Consider what you're going to do for those who are medically exempt. What will that look like? If they're medically exempt from having the vaccine, what does that mean? Can you continue to have them on the front line, or again, do you need to look at redeployment? So the change in law on the vaccine will not exempt employers from what I've just discussed there, which is normal employment law rules. So regardless of the reason for the termination of the employment, proper procedures will need to be followed, even if it is a valid reason for terminating employment, because dismissals could still be unfair in these circumstances if those procedures weren't followed. And it's for that reason that if you do get into the situation where you're looking at having to either redeploy or terminate an employee, you should always seek advice at that point, whether that is with ourselves as your HR provider or with an internal HR team that you've got. You should make sure that you consult with them on that individual circumstance to make sure that the process that you're following is correct. So the next part then is around storing vaccine information, which I've said is a tricky thing in itself. So the next slide talks about the ICO. So in terms of risk assessments and COVID secure, all employers are required to undertake a risk assessment to make sure that their workplace is COVID secure. So therefore, it's reasonable to think that employers have to have a legitimate reason to collect vaccine data. If you are working in a care home and your business is a care home, or it's one of the businesses that's associated with work in a care home, then that is what we would deem a legitimate reason to collect that data. But they warn that keeping vaccination data for just monitoring purposes, so you can see who hasn't had it, could be a little bit more difficult to justify. Whilst that's not been ruled out, and you can ask and you can store, even if you're not in these industries, they're putting a little bit of a warning over it, so it would be worthwhile taking some advice. One thing that is clear though is even when you have that legitimate reason for taking, storing and keeping that information, you should collect limited information and hold it for no longer than necessary. What that will look like will come out as we get more guidance, and we're expecting more information on this, but this is the feel that we're getting at the moment. And when you're talking to employees, you should be told them why you've got to have that information, how it will be stored, how long it will be stored for, and who will be able to have access, because obviously this is personal information. In terms of mandating the vaccine though, if you're mandating the vaccine, you need to ask the employees to disclose their vaccination status. So the ICO has said that their advice to organisations who are collecting vaccine status confirm that this data must be necessary and relevant for a specific purpose. That is the information that they're giving us at the moment. However, it confirms that there needs to be a good reason for collecting it. There may be a lawful basis to process this data, and I guess that's the important distinction to make. And what this information will be classed as is special category data. Obviously, this is quite different to something that has happened before. It's an unusual situation, it's a new situation. Even 16 months into this pandemic, things are changing so quickly, we are all still learning. But before processing any data regarding vaccination status, employees should carry out a data protection impact assessment, which would classify this as special category. So it's recording why you as a business need this data, and you undertake a risk assessment to make sure that it's reasonable for you to keep this data, particularly in the short term. And as I said before, monitoring, just keeping that information for monitoring purposes, whilst the ICO are not saying you shouldn't do that, they're saying it may be a little bit more difficult to justify to employees, especially those who say, I don't want to tell you what my vaccination status is, over why you legitimately need that. Nonetheless, however, particularly where you have to mandate it, collect the information, collect the limited information, hold it for no longer than necessary, and make sure the employees know exactly why they are needing it. But back to the cases in care homes as they stand at the moment, or businesses associated with care homes, failure by an employee to disclose their vaccination status would in itself potentially lead to disciplinary action or disciplinary matter, because this is something that is going to be required by law. And that's the difference here. So obviously we're kind of aiming this webinar at what we know is going to be mandatory, but we know we've got lots of other businesses who for very good reasons are concerned about the vaccination status of their employees and would like to gather that information. So trying to cover both, but make sure you're aware of all the kind of consequences and issues around it. So on to the next thing then. For the care home industry in particular, the biggest thing is going to be managing those who refuse the vaccine. And I think it's important when we go into the next slide that we first of all look at what the reasons are for refusing the vaccine. Now, the first one is medical grounds. And we are sort of still waiting for the government to clarify who is medically exempt. There is some information around, but not enough for us to make that final call yet. But we believe it will reflect what is called the Green Book on Immunisation against Infectious Diseases. And this will be advice from the Joint Committee on Vaccinations. It's unlikely to include those where the vaccination is not clinically appropriate, so some kind of pre-existing diagnosis. There may be temporary restrictions which will apply, and they'll be given a suitable grace period, but the government intends to produce the guides on exactly what this looks like, and then steps that should be taken to mitigate the risk of COVID transmission from workers who are exempt. So we are awaiting further guidance on this, but just have this in your mind that this is going to be one of the reasons for refusing the vaccine. The second part is what about pregnant employees? As of the 16th of April this year, the advice for pregnant women changed, and it was now recommended that the vaccination should be had, albeit that it should be a specific vaccination such as Pfizer or Moderna. This is a significant change to the previous advice, which was that routine vaccination should not be offered to pregnant women. Again, however, we are waiting for final clarification over whether this will be a valid reason Although the guidance has changed recently, it is still just guidance. So when the government give us more information about who is medically exempt within these industries, including pregnancy, they will give us their stance on that. But at the moment, their guidance is for pregnant women to have the vaccination. But this may be one of the things where they give people a grace period to allow them to continue their pregnancy without having the vaccine, and we'll await further detail on that. The third reason, common reason for refusing the vaccine, is around religious beliefs. So the Equality Act obviously protects employees against discrimination on the grounds of religion or belief. And there are a small number of religious groups who disapprove of the vaccinations and have made this publicly known, but most religions do not disagree with the vaccination in principle. This is a difficult topic to handle, but the main thing is that there's been some concerns over what ingredients or stabilisers have been used in the production of COVID-19. But none of those vaccines have actually been rolled out in the UK, which contain any animal-derived ingredients. And what we are seeing is that many religious leaders have publicly urged their followers to accept the vaccination. There will be some individuals with protected belief against vaccinations, but the ingredients that are in the vaccinations, combined with the religious leaders and campaigning groups advocating the vaccination, means that the likelihood of it being a valid belief-based objection is actually significantly reduced now. And we wouldn't think it'd be a consideration for most employers. The government at the moment has decided not to provide a belief-based exemption for care home staff because it would be far too difficult to implement and would risk undermining the overall policy. What we don't know, though, is how a tribunal will view that further down the line. That is something that will come out and time will tell. But I think it's one of those situations where this would be really important for you to seek specific advice at the time of having this issue once you have talked to your employee. If they are saying they do not want to take it for religious-based belief, then speak to an HR professional. The other reason or other thing that I wanted to bring up around managing those who refuse the vaccine are around risks that people associate with the vaccine. So there is currently an issue that is well known in the press around certain vaccines, in particular the AstraZeneca vaccine, and a risk of potential blood clots. It is important to stress that employees cannot force an employee to be vaccinated against their wish. That is not within your rights to do that. What is within your rights is to manage what happens after they refuse. But if an employee decides not to be vaccinated because of the rare risk of blood clots, then their employer is not able to compel them. Employees who are wishing to mandate the vaccine, the key question is whether they can establish strong enough reasons to justify the dismissal of their employee. Where this is in a care home, there will be a much more stronger justification. I think the thing with the risk of blood clots, because we know this is associated with one particular make of vaccine, there's obviously the alternative to go down of them having one of the other types of the vaccine. So I would hope that that risk would be minimised. These individuals wouldn't typically be protected under discrimination law, but again, they would still have the right to claim unfair dismissal if they have over 2 years service. And that's why employees should be really careful about how they go about this process, how they ask their employees, the steps that they take after that to mitigate the risk and to move things forward. And then if it ultimately does lead in dismissal, then you need to be very careful about the procedure that you've followed to make sure that if it did end up in a tribunal, that you'd have the strong enough case to defend it. Although, as I said before, the truth is that we will be potentially defending something that hasn't been written in case law yet because it's such a new topic, and we will wait and see how that plays out. But the key is making sure that you get that step-by-step help at the time where you're dealing with this difficult situation. One other thing that we wanted to cover then was around handling sick leave. So if we just move on to the next slide. Yeah, and the next one. So handling sick leave post-vaccine. So one of the things that you can do as an employer is really help encourage the vaccine uptake by communicating, being open and honest, allowing people to share their fears or concerns and have talks about it. There's certainly no general right in law for employees to have time off for medical appointments, but in this circumstance, common sense should really prevail. We would expect most employers would allow time off for vaccinations, and there are many good reasons to do so. It's encouraging the employees to have the vaccine. If you're allowing them paid time off, that gives them more incentive, and it also adheres to the ACAS guidelines. Do check your policies and procedures though, as they may include the right to attend medical appointments, but even if they don't, it's certainly something that if you're wanting your employees to have the vaccine, that you should encourage to allow them to take time off. And then I guess following that, when you're talking about the vaccine after effects, for those of you who have taken the vaccine up or have spoken to people who have, it's quite hit and miss over what the next steps are. Some people feel absolutely fine. Some people have an achy arm. Some people have felt like they couldn't get out of bed for a day. Manage that sickness in the same way that you would manage your own sickness policy. Record the time, talk to the employee, do the return to work, and allow them to follow the normal sickness procedures. I think the only word of caution that I would give, and this isn't something you have to do, but if they have taken time off post-vaccine because of not feeling well enough to work, and that has potentially tripped some kind of trigger for formal action, then you may want to consider discounting that in the same way that we say you may want to discount any COVID-related illnesses. It's something that you should definitely consider. So the final part then, before we move on to questions, I wanted to make sure that we had enough time for questions, as I imagine there are going to be quite a few, was about talking to you about helping develop a vaccine policy. So if you are a company that are mandating that employees should have the vaccine and you have a valid reason to do that, i.e. care homes, or if you want to just offer an incentive for employees to take up the vaccine because of your own kind of focus on COVID security and getting your workplace back up and running, the policy will help you explain and communicate your approach. And this is, as I said before, about being open and honest, and also talking about any incentives offered. So for the majority of employees, a vaccination policy might not be important, but you may find it helpful in explaining to the rest of the organisation your company's stance on how you're moving forward with COVID and your stance on vaccinations. And it is okay to have an objective that you want as many employees as possible vaccinated to help protect your staff. A vaccination policy for a mandatory one will obviously be slightly different, but it would still be something that any organisation could consider. It also might help when you're handling workplace disputes that are regarding a vaccination. If you have made from the beginning your point and your stance very clear, that may help you further down the line to have that policy to rely on. You could consider requesting employees not to ask each other about vaccination status. This is something that you may want to consider, and this is more around the fact that, as I said, it's a very hot topic. I think most employees are resound to the fact that this will happen, but it could create very difficult and uncomfortable conversations. If you have a group of 5 people in a team, they're all asking each other about their vaccination status. Which one have you had? How many have you had? Oh, you've not had it. Why have you not had it? There is the potential for that to become a not very good situation in terms of employee relations between staff. It is a very hot and sometimes controversial topic. So there is an option that you could put in your policy that you do not want your employees to talk about their vaccination status to other people, and this is particularly where it's not mandatory, to try and avoid those situations in the first place. Obviously just a consideration, but I think it's important that we kind of call that out as an option. Or if you're not doing that, just at least know that there's a potential for some of those conversations to be quite difficult, and you may get an influx of people coming to management saying, look, I've been asked about my vaccination status, whether I have or I haven't had it, I'm really not comfortable about making that public knowledge. It's just kind of another area for you to consider, even if you're not mandating that, how are you going to handle those situations? But overall, a policy for both mandatory or for encouraging will really help sort of set out your stall from the beginning on how you as an employer are looking to deal with this. So just before we move on to Q&A, I just wanted to take the time to remind you of the Morepay support that is online. We have a joined up approach from our health and safety and HR specialist teams who can help you with your current situation, your objectives, and help get you up and running again. And we do this on a day-to-day basis through our normal advice lines, which our customers have access to. But one thing that we've developed to assist customers with their more bespoke needs and give them more tailored support is a piece of consultancy that we are calling Back to Work Emerging from the Lockdown. Now, we did actually start this last year when in the summer things started opening up, and I'll be honest, I did not think we'd be sat here again having the same conversation, having spent the most of winter lockdown again, but we are here. But what this allows you is tailored support about the areas that you need help with in helping emerge from lockdown. There will be businesses that are starting to open up again following the dubbed Freedom Day, and have lots of questions about whether they still need to make their workplaces COVID secure, what are the pros and cons, what should they keep, what should they ditch. Lots of unanswered questions now. We're being asked to sort of maybe use our common sense a little bit more. What does that mean for the workplace? On top of that, now we're emerging and back to work from the lockdown, the vaccination piece is an element of this, and we could certainly input that into the consultancy, but it would help you create that safe working environment, and that's what our teams would do. And from both an HR and a health and safety perspective, would encourage you to look at how you can make that. And it's just basically one simple package of dedicated support. There is no ongoing contract to sign. It's just we're here to help with this very specific and particular hot topic at the moment. So that concludes the webinar. I will hand over back to talk through questions.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Michelle. So yeah, the good news is we've got plenty of time for questions. So Michelle, I hope you're ready. We've had a couple of people just cover off to start, a couple of people asking if the session's being recorded. It definitely is, and I will get that recording to you hopefully today, but if not, definitely within the next couple of days. And I can certainly share a PDF copy of the slide deck as well. So first question, and this is a lengthy-ish one. So this is from Lucy. So Lucy says, we are a very small charity and have already asked our staff in a survey if they have accepted the vaccine. I don't think anyone has said no, but I want to record their second vaccination dates in our HR system. Is this allowed? Do I ask for it, or can I say it's mandatory to confirm the vaccination date?
I think unless you are one of the legally obliged organisations like care homes, making a mandatory policy, you need to have a justifiable reason for it. And I caveat, and I'll probably caveat most questions with this, and I don't mean it to sound like a cop-out, it's just that each circumstance is so individual. I'd hate to sort of give sweeping statements. But in this situation, you need a justifiable reason as to why you're recording this information. Some employees want to do this as part of you know, a COVID secure workplace, but you really need to think end to end. If you're asking for vaccination status, if you're asking for vaccination dates, what are you going to do if someone either refuses to give it to you or hasn't had the vaccine? What are the consequences of that? You absolutely have the right to ask people, and it depends on the way you approach it. If you have already asked about the first vaccination and you've explained the reasons why you want to know and that you're going to securely store this information and employees were quite willing to give you that information, then you are absolutely okay to go and do that again. I just think you need to think about what the longer term consequences are. If someone says, I'm not telling you, or I'm not having the vaccine, what does that mean then? So it's just thinking that end to end, and whether it is in the shape of a vaccine policy, or you just as a business have decided why you want that information, what you're going to do with it, and what the consequences are of not getting. the answer that you want, because in most cases when businesses are asking for this, it's because they want to know that all their workforce has been vaccinated, therefore the individuals are protected, they can tell other employees they're protected. It's all done with the right reasons. We just need to approach it with care. So yes, you can ask, and it may just be a case of being open and honest with the small team and saying, look, this is why we want to know. We're going to secure it in this place securely for this amount of time. It's all towards helping us with the COVID secure opening. But make sure you've thought of the ongoing consequences, and if you do have any kickback, that you seek specialist advice.
Yeah, okie doke. A question from Katie. So, is deciding whether an employee has to isolate or not after the 16th of August, as a close contact of someone who presumably has a positive status, is that a legitimate reason to collect vaccination status?
It could be. Again, we are awaiting more detail on what that will mean going forward, and whether it will be an employer's duty to make sure that that is correct. So if someone is pinged to isolate after the 16th of August, and obviously if they're double vaccinated, they don't have to. What we will wait for clarification on is whether that is an employer's obligation to make sure that is right, or whether it is down to an individual or an employee to kind of be telling the truth on that, if that makes sense. I'm hoping that we will get some more clarification on exactly what that will look like in the next few weeks, because we've not really been told how that will work. Will the test and trace still ping everybody and then it's just up to them to say, no, I'm double vaccinated? Will the test and trace system be able to identify the people who've been double vaccinated? And therefore it would be very easy to ask an employee to show you. I think we need to wait and see how the system is going to work at that point, before we can help employers understand how to handle that.
Yeah. A question from Joanne. So we are commercial cleaners. We work on multiple sites, albeit not care homes. If a client asks us to only send vaccinated staff on site, what do we do?
I think you need to understand the reason why that client is asking for vaccinated staff only. That would be the first thing you've got to do, and then find out, is that a legitimate reason? And you may need to seek some advice over what is and is not a legitimate reason. Because as I said, there may be companies who decide to mandate it, but they've got to come up with the reasons. But if they're also asking like subcontractors to do that, then that's a separate issue. So I'd be asking them why. I'd be asking them to see details of their policy. Then if there is a legitimate reason, then they will be seeing if you can manage that within your workforce. Have you got vaccine information? It may be that there is a legitimate reason, and then that means that therefore you have to collect the vaccination information as well. I think the difficulty at the moment is that we're still waiting for quite a bit of information on this. We are still waiting even for the detail on what it's going to be like for care homes. We just know that it's going to be happening and employers should be thinking about it. There isn't really any clear guidance on whether it is or it isn't okay for you to mandate it without government guidance. And it will all depend on very individual circumstances. I would certainly start with questioning why, and then that will allow you to translate into what that means for your business.
A question from Helen. If we want to protect our employees against infection and we have someone who refuses to have the vaccine, do we have the right to mandate that that person works from home instead?
Possibly, yes. It will all go back again, and it's probably the same kind of common theme in all these, is what is the reason for it. Obviously, there is a general push from the government that the vaccine is the best way to protect the country. But the government aren't mandating the vaccine. They are not making it mandatory at the moment, apart from care homes. Businesses who go into care homes to perform duties that are face-to-face, and there is talk of it being in the NHS. And that's where it makes it a little bit difficult. But if you believe that having gone through all the process, that it is a legitimate reason to ask them to keep working from home, and it's an alternative to them coming into the office. What you have to make sure is that you're not making them suffer a detriment because of that. So again, you need to go right back to why are you refusing the vaccine, explain the company's stance on encouragement to take the vaccine, why you're doing it, and then again, take it from there and seek specialist advice on that individual case.
Yeah. A good question from Julia. Would we be allowed or able to inquire about vaccination status when recruiting and interviewing?
Yes, you can. You can ask for this information from employees and potential employees, but you need to be very clear about what you're using that information for and why. And I think that's going to be the key to all of this. Is if you're, you know, at a recruitment stage, if you're asking at a recruitment stage, there has to be a kind of a follow up to that. If you just ask the question and that's it, then that could lead to people not wanting to join or not even wanting to come to the interview because they're not sure why you're asking. I think it would be about making your policy, your stance very clear to all of your business and very clear at recruitment stage. And again, what are the consequences of them not doing? So if you have a candidate who says, I'm not going to tell you, or no, I've not had it, what does that mean? Are you just going to not interview them? Have they got no chance of getting the job? What is the consequence of that? What are you trying to sort of gain from that? And if you are trying to gain that you only want vaccinated people in the organisation, have you got that legitimate reason to do it? Because you just don't want to open yourself up to any potential employment issues further down the line. So if someone's saying they're not vaccinated because of a medical exemption, that's why if you are asking that question, it needs to be in a very detailed way.
Yeah, okay. Question from Antonia. So we're an office-based organisation, so vaccines do not need to be mandatory, but we do have a member of staff who's refusing to have the vaccine, and other members of the team have caught wind of this and obviously aren't very happy about it because they're going to be in close contact with the person. So she'd just like to know essentially what they should be doing. So far, they've made their offices COVID secure. They've told their staff this in communications. They've encouraged staff to have vaccines through the newsletter, and they've even got lateral flow tests in reception. Is there anything else you think Antonia and her team could potentially be doing in this scenario?
I think what they've done so far is absolutely everything they should be doing. They've made every effort to encourage, support, guide their employees and make their workplace COVID secure. I think the next step would be if this is causing a problem with a particular person or a particular group of individuals who are not happy with the fact that this individual has not been vaccinated, then it would be treating that as kind of an informal employee dispute in terms of, you know, the relationships of work colleagues, and talking to those individuals and trying to kind of mediate and agree a way forward, because the last thing you want is to feel like the individual who hasn't had the vaccine, it's like a witch hunt against that person. So you're still managing a very delicate situation. I think everything they've done so far, it would just be if this continues, then there is the option to kind of try a more local level to come to a reasonable conclusion, just more from a workplace harmony and engagement perspective.
Yeah. Lisa's asked if we've got any examples of a vaccination policy. Do you know if we might have something on the HR hub already, like a template or something we might be able to share?
I'm not sure there is one on the hub at the moment, but what I would do is if we just take the details of who asked that question, I can pass it on to the policy team.
Lovely. Okay, so Lisa, we'll come back to you on that one. Okay, so quite a few questions a little bit like this, and it's similar to Antonia's. So Karen's asked, you know, for staff who can't be vaccinated, again, not in a care home, like how do you deal with those staff who won't want to work near them? I know we've sort of covered some of that with Antonia's, but is there a way to deal with that?
I think it's dealing with those on an individual basis and dealing with those individuals. And the other thing that's going to be really important in this is showing that you are mitigating that risk, because obviously you cannot force anyone to have a vaccine in the same way that your employees cannot force one of their colleagues to have a vaccine. The government have not mandated it, other from what we've talked about already. It is going to be at a very local level that you manage these things. And I think the biggest thing that you can do as an organisation is show everything else that you're doing to keep the workplace COVID secure. I know there's been a lot of uncertainty and confusion about what happens after yesterday. We've gone from quite strict restrictions to all bets are off kind of thing, and that has caused a lot of confusion amongst everybody. And whilst it's saying, well, adults can make choices, that's not very easy in the workplace because everyone's going to be making different choices. So there are a lot of organisations who are continuing to keep some, if not all, of their COVID secure measures in a bid, especially while cases are rising, in a bid to mitigate the impact of somebody not being vaccinated. I would think it would be a really wise thing to seek some health and safety advice on this about what else can you do that would legitimately be saying to those people, yes, there are people who aren't vaccinated in the organisation, but given that we're doing A, B, C and this is our policy on it, we are doing everything we are obliged to do to protect you.
Rachel's also asked for a copy of a vaccine policy or an example. So again, Rachel, we'll come back to you separately on that one. We have got lots of questions still flooding in, but just conscious of time, we're on 22, so we've got a few minutes left. So I think probably time for a couple more questions and then we'll wrap things up. So one from Diana. So in addition to / instead of mandating vaccines, and I'm not sure what sort of business Diana works at, but she's asked as a workplace if they're allowed to mandate face masks and the use of the NHS Test and Trace app.
I think it would be perfectly reasonable to still say that masks are in place. Again, this is where it's really difficult that government have said, use your common sense, but when you're trying to coordinate that against potentially hundreds of people with very different opinions, I think you need to be clear on what you are doing, why you're doing it. And this is helping mitigate risk. I certainly think things like masks, I think it would be okay to mandate them to wear masks at the moment as part of a COVID secure policy. And given where we are in terms of cases rising and still rising, I guess we aren't as a country where we thought we were going to be when this roadmap was set out in February. We really did believe Freedom Day was going to be Freedom Day, very low cases, and that isn't the case. Again, though, I would seek advice, because it all comes back to, you can mandate it, but what are you going to do about the consequences of them refusing, and have you a justified reason to take action against it? And that's why it would, even if you're putting a policy together about whether that's test and trace or masks, seek advice on that so that you can get that end-to-end policy process mapped out and you're very clear from the beginning. Then you can be very clear with your employees.
Okay, so one final question. So Pauline has asked, when we've said that all employees are required to undertake a risk assessment to take measures to make their workplace COVID secure, is this just for care homes or is this for all employers?
No, all employers should take risk assessments to make sure that they're as COVID secure as possible. Even with the lifting of restrictions this week, it is still strongly advisable that a risk assessment is taken of a workplace. It's the same as you do with any risk assessment, that you'd make sure that the water heater, there's no, where people get their cups of tea from, that there's no risks around that. There's no risks around trips and falls. You've got to think of COVID in exactly the same way. It is still something that is very much real, something that still very much needs managing. And as a responsible employer, you should undertake a risk assessment to prove what you are doing to mitigate those risks. And again, there's lots of help and advice out there, and on with Morepay, the health and safety advice line, the HR hub, there's countless stuff on there. But it's still really important to realise, and even Boris Johnson said this, this pandemic is not over. It is still very much a real part of our lives. They are just trying to learn how to live with it at the moment, and it's all part of your responsibilities as a reasonable and responsible employer.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you to everybody who asked a question. Lots of really great questions there. I'll just point you in the direction of our Knowledge Centre, which is easy to find in the menu on our website. It's packed with lots of helpful resources, including blog posts from our experts, and all of our upcoming webinars are always on here as well. So have a look around if you've not already. Everything's completely free to download. So yeah, go for gold. And that's everything from us. So I appreciate a few people had asked about getting a copy of a policy template. So we will come back to you separately. And obviously everybody who's attended today will get a recording and a copy of the slides as well. So hopefully you find those useful. Thank you so much, Michelle, for hosting today. You've been fantastic as always. And with that, I'm going to close the webinar. So I hope everybody enjoys the rest of this lovely sunny day. Thanks, everyone.